here in North Kingstown, and I appreciate you coming out. We ended up canceling due to the ugly weather forecast last Saturday, but it turns out we could have actually probably done it last Saturday, but so be it. Today we have a nice day, actually. It's probably a good day for this. It's not too hot. We won't be baking in the sun, and I won't have to do my entire walk searching for shady spots so we don't lose any people in the walk, so that'll be nice. This is a very important story, I think, and it's a story that's long overdue being told because we here in the state of Rhode Island have a long and very complicated history with African American and Native American people, with the people of color, with black people in our communities. And it's been hushed up and told differently, made into fairy tales, and we're going to talk about a lot of that as we walk around today. We'll talk about mixed race Narragansett African American folks and their contributions to the communities, what their lives were like, what they were up against, and of course we'll be talking about people who were enslaved in this community and people who were free blacks and free Narragansett folks who were living in the community, living lives here in Wickford Village. And this month is every month this year of our 350th anniversary, we've picked either a village or a topic to focus on. And for us, this month is August. This is a month where we're going to talk about diversity. Because one of the things I've noted in my 25 years of looking at North Kingstown history and South County history in general is that it's all been told, all the kind of stuff you would get from the 1800s and 1900s that kind of make the basis for historians today has all been told from one perspective, and that is the rich white guy perspective, because these were the guys who had the ability to tell these stories. I mean, they had the education, they had the money, they had the time to sit down and write down the way of the world that they were living in now. They were concerned about losing that because the world was changing rapid fire at that time frame as the Industrial Revolution changed everything in not only Rhode Island, but throughout the entire United States. So folks were concerned about the life that they knew as children and as young adults, and they wanted to record it, to write it down. The Industrial Revolution was wiping that world away, and so these are the people who did all the writing of local history, started all the small house museums like Casey Farm, Smith's Castle, Gilbert Stuart's birthplace. All these places were started by that group of people who said, our world is being taken away from us by the Industrial Revolution. We want it to be remembered, and that's who they were. Basically rich white men. So they told stories about the world from their perspective. And in doing so, and I don't think there was a lot of deliberate action here, but in doing so, these gentlemen wrote out whole parts of the population because they didn't fit the rich white guy world that they lived in. So contributions of women was wiped away, and the contributions of people of color was wiped away by these folks. So reconstituting that portion of our history has been an important part of what I've been doing for the last decade or so, because it really does make for a better story. It tells the whole story of Wickford, the whole story of North Kingstown, the whole story of Rhode Island, and it's just a more colorful, interesting story. So that's part of what we're going to do with this Diversity Month, is explore what these other people who were here in the 17 and 1800s, what did they do? How did they contribute to the history, the story of what made North Kingstown, and made the United States the United States? Because this stuff carries throughout the entire nation in some respects. The story, too, is very personal for me. In the late 1960s, my mother, who was a widow at that time with kids, was trying to decide what she was going to do with her life, and she decided to do what she felt most comfortable doing, being a mom, and she stepped into the Rhode Island foster care system and became a foster mother for numerous children. Some of those children she was able to adopt, and when all was said and done after this, my mother and I and my two siblings were living in the village of Wickford in 1969 in a mixed race family, because my mother adopted 3 black children. And if you know anything about Wickford in the 1960s, there was no whiter community around. So it was kind of a wake-up call for me as a young 10, 12, 13, 14-year-old to see the life that my 3 new black siblings lived, what they were up against. certainly I can't say I was in their skin and felt it all, but to grow up, to go to school in North Kingstown, to live a life in North Kingstown, and to see the challenges that they were presented with. So for me, as I grew older and began to think more and more about what that must have been like for them, I realized that this story not only is important from a historic perspective, but from a personal perspective. Because once I found out about this, and I found out about these three young people that grew up with me as brothers and sisters, I realized that their heritage was the heritage that we're going to talk about today, a mixed race, Narragansett Indian and black. And part of that story we will tell today. So I owe them that. And we all owe everybody who was here in North Kingstown, whether they be white men or women or people of color, to tell the story completely. So that's kind of what we're going to do today. This is a really good place for us to start because it has some connections to this. This place, although it wasn't paved and it was a little bit smaller, was pretty much like this back in the 1700s when Wickford began. This was the commercial center of the village. Wickford at that time frame was a place that was totally connected to the maritime trade. There were 5 shipyards ringing Wickford, cranking out small to medium-sized sailing vessels all year round, and there were numerous vessels that called Wickford Harbor home and were involved in coastal trading. So this was a busy place. And part of the trading that went on in Wickford, because Wickford also had 2 rum distilleries, was the triangle trade. And most people probably know a little bit about what that is, but let me give you the Reader's Digest condensed version of it. It really was a Rhode Island enterprise, a Rhode Island innovation, nothing to be proud of though, where we had 3 commodities that were very high value, that were traded and bartered and sold along the way to make up this triangle. Ships that were loading up here in Wickford will be loading up with one of the most famous commodities made in the state of Rhode Island, rum. Rhode Island rum was known throughout the British Empire as the best rum. And Rhode Island rum was a huge part of the financial enterprise here that kept the colony of Rhode Island going. The 2 rum distilleries in here just paled in comparison to the amount of rum that was being made in Bristol and Newport and Warren and Providence, but they were still making it here. So the ships would be loading up with barrels of rum. Nice and clean looking industry, you know, barrels of rum going onto a ship. The ship sails off with Rhode Island sailors, Rhode Island captains, all Wickford born and bred here in this place, off to go across the Atlantic. They cross the Atlantic and end up on the coast of West Africa with this rum. That's their first stop. And this West African chieftains at that time frame, Africa was not a place that had a real government. This was all, the whole continent was tribal in nature, and there was tribal warfare going on, as you would expect in these kinds of areas. And the stronger tribes who were winning battles were catching their neighbors, children and women and men, and selling them off into slavery. The slave trade at that time, which was largely dominated by European and English interests, was something that Rhode Island was beginning to get into. And Rhode Island rum was known by these folks who were there on the west coast of Africa. So rum was sold there to certain parties in West Africa and traded to these chieftains for slaves. So the rum would go all off the ship, some money would come on, and the rest of the ship would be filled up with slaves. Those slaves were then put on a terrible voyage, jam-packed into the ship in the hold where we used to have rum barrels, and taken not back to the United States, but taken to the Caribbean islands. The Caribbean islands at that time frame were almost completely under British control and were being utilized for sugarcane plantations. Refined sugar was a huge moneymaker for the British Empire. The refined sugar really helped finance the British Empire. And the Caribbean was perfectly suited for growing sugarcane, which was, of course, what sugar was made from. And going from a sugarcane plant to having sugar is a very labor-intensive process, and the British knew that the least expensive way to do that was with slave labor. So these slaves that were caught in West Africa on the ship were then sold off to people in the Caribbean or traded for rum. So again, all the slaves go off the ship in Caribbean. Again, Wickford captains, Wickford sailors, all Rhode Island and Newport and Wickford financed, and the ship is then loaded back up with barrels of rum, or barrels of molasses from the sugarcane plantations. One of the big products that were coming out of the sugarcane plantations was molasses. And the molasses would come back into the Rhode Island ports and be offloaded again and be made into eventually rum, because molasses at that time frame was the main ingredient in making rum. So that completes the triangle. Every leg of that triangle was making money for Wickford business investors, Newport business investors, Bristol business investors, and Providence business investors. And Rhode Island was just reaping the benefits of this triangle trade. And again, a big part of that had to do with slavery. So although ships would go off here leave with rum and come back with molasses, you didn't see the ugly part of this triangle trade voyage that was being sailed out of Wickford Harbor. Additionally, this would have been a place along with the North Ferry location down where the URI School of Oceanography is now, where slaves that were purchased for use in South County would have been brought in. And there were no real slave auction sites here on the West Bay. All that occurred in Bristol and Newport largely. So new slaves coming into South County would be coming in and being offloaded here at this location or down in South Ferry. And so we think about slaves, and I think we want to think about South County and how, because it's probably not something that you think about. Naturally, you think about this being a place where there are lots of slaves, but the reality is southern Rhode Island, at its peak in the period just before the Revolution, was known to have the highest percentage population of enslaved or indentured people in the entire United States of America, other than the Deep South. At any given time, 21 or 22% of everybody that was here in South County was enslaved. This all goes back to what was going on here at South County at that time frame, and that was, of course, villages like Wickford, but there really weren't that many really population centers. But it was surrounded by the lands that were owned by the Narragansett planters, which were a group of folks who were given the vacant Narragansett lands, they were called after the King Philip's War, to do agriculture in support of the British Empire. So in the end, you ended up with, and this is an amazing fact, not quite as amazing as the fact that 21% of our population was enslaved, but the vast majority of all the lands and everything that we know as South County now was owned by 13 families. So all the way from Smith's Castle area, all the way down to the border with Westerly, almost all that land was owned by 13 families, the Narragansett planters. We'll talk a little bit more about them when we're at their meeting house, the old Narragansett Church. But these were big agribusinesses. These weren't little farms. These were huge agribusinesses, anywhere from 700 acres to 2,500 acres in size. And they were doing agriculture specifically in support of the British Empire at that time frame. Again, big farms like that are labor intensive. And just like with the sugarcane plantations in the Caribbean, the most economical way to run that big farm is to use slave labor. So this is why we have so many enslaved people in South County at that time frame. And really, as we'll walk around here in Wickford, I'd like to point out that in the 17 and 1800s, the Wickford of that time frame was far more diverse in its population than it ever was in the 20th century. And again, this story that we just kind of blazed through quite quickly plays into what we'll talk about at our next stop, which has to do with the folks who ended up being a great portion of those enslaved people of mixed race, Narragansett, and African American. So we'll be talking about that as we walk forward to our next stop. We basically do a big loop around the southern part of Old Wickford and end up right back here. So does anybody have any questions about this general overview at this time before we head out? All right, we're going to walk down Pleasant Street to another stop. If you're not a Wickford resident, please take your time and enjoy the scenery along the way. All right, this little front section of this larger 20th, 21st century home dates from 1869, and it was the building that was here on this property from 1869 until just recently. The folks who sold it off had been living in this house for generation upon generation, and they're the people we're going to talk about today. When the house was sold, the first people who bought it were going to tear down this piece. I mean, didn't look this nice back then, I'll be frank with you. It was kind of run down a little bit. But over time they were convinced and cajoled by the town to try to save it, to try to keep it, because it really is something that tells a whole nother story about this area of Pleasant Street. And so this house is known as the Thomas Weeden Morgan House, and it was, as I said, built in 1869. And at that time frame, if you take a look at, as we walked up there, I don't know if you might have noticed, but this was Main Street in Wickford from 1709 on. And think about the types of houses that are on this street largely. It was Main Street back then. But we have like a small handful of colonial era homes on the street anymore. And that all has to do with the year 1815, when what was then known as the Great Gale of 1815 came through the Narragansett Bay. And it was a large-scale hurricane. It wasn't really a gale. At least as big as the 38 hurricane, perhaps bigger, that came up the bay and essentially wiped out most of the colonial era homes. We have the wonderful Updike house we went by in the beginning that's set back from the road a little bit with a beautiful Newport mansion style. We have a center chimney brick colonial here that's in green. That's also from that time frame. But everything else on the water side of the street was destroyed by the 1815 gale. So Main Street is not so Main Street anymore. And after the Great Gale, it was changed into Pleasant Street. All the destroyed homes were cleaned up and the land sat vacant for a while. And eventually they called the bottom end here of what was then known as the Grand Highway, which was West Main Street and Main Street now. They changed the name of that from the Grand Highway, which was the road that led from the Post Road down into Wickford. They changed that to Main Street. And this became Pleasant Street. And the land sat vacant for quite a while. Only a few homes had survived the Great Gale. And as you can imagine, people were nervous about it. They never saw anything like this. And part of this has to do with weather forecasting back then. I mean, they didn't get any warning about this in 1815. I mean, probably some old guy went out on the back porch and said, "Ah, Mom, sky looks funny today." And then blam, this incredible storm comes out here and wipes out half of Wickford. And that's no small feat considering the way houses in Wickford were constructed. I mean, think about the houses on what's now Main Street that were built mostly after that. They've withstood hurricane after hurricane. And that's because they're made out of hardwoods as framing, not the kind of pines and spruces that we use now. These houses are sturdy. They hold up. So that Great Gale of 1815 must have been extraordinarily powerful and did some incredible damage. Because really for almost a generation or more, nobody really built on Pleasant Street. It laid empty because people had in their memory how terrible this storm was. I mean, it was even so critical of a storm that the Wickford Baptist Church, which hopefully you can all visualize down there in Main Street, it's set back on a little knoll. It was originally going to be built right on the front of the street, just like everything else in a colonial village. But after the Great Gale of 1815, the church wasn't constructed yet. They changed their plans. They moved the church back up on that little hill because they were really so frightened about what happened with this storm. So the land sits vacant here for quite some time. And eventually it was purchased slowly. It was cheap prices because everybody was afraid to build on it by folks like the Thomas Weeden Morgan interrelated family. In 1869, Nancy Thomas who was just recently a widow. Her husband, Braddock Thomas, had just drowned fishing out in the Narragansett Bay. Got a mortgage to buy this land and have this little house constructed here. And as time went on in the 1800s, that's what was built here on Pleasant Street, was these tiny little houses that were built for folks who were serving the wealthy people that lived in the big houses. Nancy was the housekeeper for a wealthy family out on Main Street, and all the other little houses for here were for people who were like that. They were housekeepers, they were midwives, they were workers in factories, they were teamsters who were hauling things around the village. So the beautiful Main Street in Wickford is repopulated with small houses for working class people. Almost all of them were of the same heritage, and they were mixed race, Narragansett and African American. So we kind of alluded a little bit to their origin story, this particular population of people. How did they come about? It goes back to the Narragansett planter time frame, or soon after the Narragansett, before the Narragansett planter time frame, with the King Philip's War. And the King Philip's War was a terrible. It was as decimating to this area as the gale of 1815. If you just look at it strictly in terms of percentages, the King Philip's War was the deadliest war that was fought on American soil. 50% or so of the Native American population of Massachusetts, Rhode Island, Connecticut were killed, and 30 to 35% of the settler population was killed in this war. So, I mean, that's an incredible, I mean, the total numbers don't add up because the population of the place wasn't, but think about how that changed the face of southeastern New England. At the end of the war was done, of course, the colonists prevailed. They were also very frightened, though. And they realized that we cannot allow these tribes to reconstitute themselves. We just can't allow them to reconstitute themselves. We cannot survive another war against these people. And they already knew that some of the tribal leaders of these tribes here in southeast New England, as the war was ending, were going canoeing across the Hudson to try to get the Iroquois Nation involved in this war, trying to convince them, it's us now, it'll be you next. Their early discussions were unsuccessful, but the colonists were aware of it, and they said, we got to do something. We can't let these tribes reconstitute themselves. So the population that remained of these tribes, you know, the Wampanoags, the Massachusetts, the Narragansetts, the Pequots, all these tribes that were left here in Massachusetts, Connecticut, and Rhode Island, all the remainders were left were rounded up by the military, the militias that were still around at the end of the war, and hauled to the closest colonial capital in the area, to Providence, to Newport, to New Haven, to Hartford, to Boston, to Salem, etc., and were held in judgment, essentially. This is the way the judgment went. Here, and we'll just concentrate on Rhode Island for right now, because that's really what we're talking about. They were all brought to either Providence or Newport in judgment, and there was a trial. A magistrate sat before them, and there was a trial. They were brought in one by one. If anybody in the audience, any surviving colonist said, that guy over there, I saw him shoot an arrow and kill my neighbor, that was it. He was brought away and he was hung. So they went through there were three possible outcomes for these native people. The second group, after we go through and we call out anybody you could actually tie to what they'd call the crime of war, those were all executed. The remainder were divided up into two groups. One, the groups that included young men who were strong enough to perhaps be leaders someday, or anybody related to the leadership of these tribes. Hundreds of people in the end, hundreds of people. They were all brought together. They weren't executed, but they were put on ships and taken down to the Caribbean to spend the rest of their days cutting sugarcane for British. Indeed, there were so many of them that geneticists and ethnographers who are going down to the Caribbean now, going to Puerto Rico, going to the Bahamas, going to Bermuda, going to the island of Hispaniola, and taking a look at the maternal DNA of people who call themselves native Caribbeans, 25% of those people actually have DNA that says, no, you're not actually completely a native Caribbean, you're a southern New England Indian. 25% of people who are Caribbean, that's how many folks left southern New England and went to the Caribbean and spent their lives as slaves. So then you're left with this group of people that are left. They didn't commit an act of war. They weren't viewed as somebody who would be able to have the wherewithal or the physical strength to reconstitute the tribes. What you have is 1,000 or so native people here in Rhode Island that are left, and largely it was made up of old people, children, and women. That's really all that ended up being left after these trials concluded. They were brought before the magistrates again and say, well, you're lucky, we're not going to kill you, we're not going to hang you, we're not sending you to the Caribbean, you're going to be able to stay here. But your tribes cost us a lot of money. You owe us a lot. You, the Narragansett people, you have cost us a lot of money, you owe us. In order to pay off that accumulated debt that you cost us, we've come up with an idea where we are going to bind you over as indentured servants, and you will serve a period of time of 7 to 9 years working for a colonist. And as I said, this is a large population of folks. And the people that they were largely sent to work for were the Narragansett planters. The 13 families that were brought over here from Newport and some from this area to take over the vacant Narragansett lands and change these lands. I mean, remember, these lands were utilized by the native people here, by the Narragansetts, for agriculture for generations upon generations. It was wonderful farmlands. That's what the war was really all about, land envy. They wanted that land. So you're all going to be indentured to those people. We'll divvy you up, and you'll go out to these 13 families and start helping them turn this land over to good land that's farmed the English way. And that's where they all ended up. But again, the population that you know is, as I said, was old people, women, and children. No men that you could marry, nobody you could start a family with, no men you could start a community with. The only men that were available at that time frame, and this is in the early 1700s, was the black enslaved men that were already working for the Narragansett planters. So as you would expect, as nature goes, they all started their own families. And that's why you have Native Americans who live in southern New England who, if you didn't know anything, you walk up to them and you would think they were just a black person. But they're not. Their heritage is tied to that connection. And the names are intriguing too. I mean, the names of many of these planters, Hazard, Updike, all these 13 names. There is just as many people living in Rhode Island now who have been here for generations who are, we use Hazard for a perfect example, that are white Hazards, and there's just as many black Hazards in Rhode Island now. And they are tied together in this one period of time. So that's how these tribes came to be, is through that King Philip's War. So let's gets us back to this house, built in 1869 on a mortgage that was held by this woman's employer. So she'd be here and available to take care of their houses. They had 2 houses in the village of Wickford that they used at that time as summer getaways. They were working in New York City at the time, and Nancy and her children took care of the houses for them and lived here. And the story repeats itself over and over again with the little houses that were here. And the house stayed in the family from 1869 up until the 2000s. This house was in direct descendant of Nancy Thomas. Generation upon generation of folks lived in this house until a gentleman named Tommy Morgan lived at the end of his days in this house. And when he passed away, his family sold off the property. And so this house tells us that story. But this story also tells us a lot about the Narragansett folks that we see today. Why, if I talk to people about the Narragansett Indians, they all say, well, I don't understand why they're so angry. Well, that's a pretty good story to be angry about, and that's just the beginning of it. Let's also not forget Another part of the story, if you said to a Narragansett, and they would say, what do you guys think about Roger Williams? They'd no sooner spit on the ground. Because you know who was the guy at the end of his life who signed off on this deal to send all these people to court to divvy them up in those three fashions? It was Roger Williams. At the end of the day, he realized the war had come. His dream of a place where native people and settlers would live together in peace was over. And he capitulated. He just said, there's nothing else I can do. He signed the papers. They really wanted him to sign off on it because of his identity as the founder of the colony. He capitulated. He signed the paper. And he acknowledged that this was going to happen. He knew this was the fate for these people, and he signed off on it. So they're not fans of Roger Williams. They're not fans of the way they were treated. And they're not even fans of the way they're treated now. The Narragansett tribe is the only sovereign tribe in the entire United States of America that is prohibited by federal law from having a casino. Another guy that we think of Rhode Island was, let this guy go through here. Rhode Island, that was such a great part of Rhode Island's political history, John Chafee, he single-handedly made sure that this was tied on as an add-on to an omnibus bill in the U.S. Senate and was confirmed by the House of Representatives that said that the Narragansett Indian tribe will never be allowed, even though they're recognized as a sovereign nation, but they will never be allowed to ever have a casino in the state of Rhode Island. At that time frame, Chafee was claiming that this was not about the Narragansetts, this was about the evils of gambling, but lo and behold, look at us now. We got plenty of casinos in Rhode Island, right? Not one of them is owned by the Narragansett tribe. All the money is going into the state of Rhode Island's coffers. So again, there's another really good reason to be angry. And the other part is about generations of prejudice that was laid against the Narragansett people because of their heritage and the way they looked. And I hate to say it, but when I was a kid, there were plenty of kids in the junior high school and elementary school and high school in the 1960s who would call a Narragansett person that was here, he's not a Narragansett Indian, he's a Monig Indian. And I think if you think about what that means, that's what they were faced with. So these people who lived in these areas, who served the community as free, essentially they were designated in the U.S. Census as not as free blacks, but as free mulattoes, which is also an insult. A federal government designation of a human being, a mulatto, a word that was taken and modified from the word mule, which is the offspring of a horse and a donkey, and is sterile and difficult to deal with and not very bright. And that became a federal designation, a mulatto, a mixed race white, black, or black Native American, a mulatto. So they faced this kind of racism, this kind of prejudice throughout their lifetime. And they faced this history of a tribe that was nearly annihilated by the Rhode Island colonies. And an identity that everybody did their best to stomp out from them. There was a time frame in the Victorian era where rich Victorian era folks thought nothing of having a picnic, of going down to Charleston to the Royal Burial Ground with their families and digging up graves, because you might find something good in there. I mean, can you imagine if somebody did that in Swan Point Cemetery or Elm Grove Cemetery? Well, let's go dig somebody up. And there might be a Civil War soldier sword in that box. We got to go dig it up and find it. I mean, that is what they faced throughout their history, and that is why the Narragansett people who are Narragansett tribal members, do have animosity. They are angry, and I say rightly so. It was not. They never got a fair shake. They still haven't got a fair shake. But saving this house and adding it to the front of this larger house that here was one of the things that happens really well in Wickford, is that the way that the preservation guidelines are for the historic district in Wickford are set up, it acknowledges that houses have to be practical, and in order for them to survive, they have to fit into the world that's at hand. And so this building was able to be saved here to help us to be able to tell the story of these folks that lived a whole different life here, supporting this community in the background, quietly in the background, and doing what they had to keep their families alive and to keep their dreams alive. So from here we're going to walk back down Pleasant Street and turn down Friend Street and Church Lane and go to the old Narragansett Church. Okay, this is the old Narragansett Church, built in 1707, and it's the plaque is curious, and if you're not really familiar with its history, it's even more curious. What's that mean? It was removed in 1800. Well, in 1707, this was built in the center of the Narragansett planter world, which was not Wickford. As I said, the Narragansett planter world extended from Smith's Castle in the northern portion of North Kingstown and down to the border with Westerly. And centrally located that was an area that is now off of Shermantown Road out in what we would probably call Slocum. And that's where this church was constructed in 1707 by the Narragansett planters. They, as I said, these 13 families had incredible wealth. They came here, and visitors who came during the time frame from other places like England or Europe or from Virginia or some of these more established colonies were amazed at the way these folks lived. They said, this is just like a little bit of Virginia right here in Rhode Island, because they had enormous, wonderful homes. They had vast wealth. They had hired hands, what they utilized, like hired farm hands. They had numerous slaves. They had huge businesses going on. They had extra money to hire. I mean, you think about the story of Hannah Robinson. I'm sure we all know that good Rhode Island story. Fell in love with a French dance instructor. I mean, come on, it's 1700. This is the sticks out here. How could anybody afford to import a French dance instructor? Those people could. They had a French dance instructor because they wanted to live a life. The 13 families intended to live a life that would mirror the lives of the landed gentry in England where they came from. So they had French dance instructors. They had language instructors imported from Europe and England. They had tutors that came to teach their children. They had portrait artists that came and painted pictures of them all. They had artisans that came into their homes and did stenciling on the walls and their floors. They had fine cabinet makers come from England to fill their homes with beautiful woodwork and lovely trim on the doors and on the walls. They had it all. I mean, they really were living an incredible life. But they're Anglicans. They're from England, every one of them, and they want to have a church. They got a church over in Newport. We need a church. And they're very connected to Newport. The Narragansett planters were intimately connected with the Newport business class. So between the Newport business class, who wanted to keep these families happy, so they continued to churn out the agricultural products that were required for the time, they wrote a letter back to the Church of England and said, we want to start another congregation here in the colony of Rhode Island at Providence Plantations. And we need you to send a minister. They wrote back and said, if you build a church, we'll send a minister. And so they built this church in 1707 out there in a place that's now called the Platform. And that's where it was at that time frame. It was a fine church. It really was. It was almost as fancy as the church that was in Newport at that time. The preachers that they had here, Christopher Bridge in the beginning, and then James McSparran afterwards, were accomplished Anglican ministers, very good at what they did, and came here and served this incredible community. So 13 families, all their kids, their hired hands, all came to church every Sunday. And if you worked for the Robinsons, or you worked for the Hazards, or you worked for the Updikes, you were expected to go to church here. And that included the enslaved folks that were here. You all were going to go to church here. I don't care what your religion is. I don't care what you believe. This is our church. This is where you're going. So the bottom floor of this church is full of box pews. Those were prescription pews. That's how they financed the minister at that time frame. Paying for him was through these prescription pews. So you paid a certain amount each year for your pew. You know, really rich families, probably the Hazards and the Updikes, got the pews right in front by the pulpit, and the other families all bought pews. And your hired hands and your indentured servants and your slaves were up in the gallery on the top floor, and where there are simple benches up there for them. Up until restoration in the mid part of the 20th century, there was still evidence of the manacles that were on the bottom of these benches for those reluctant slaves who really didn't want to be there to church. So imagine that. You're a slave. You're going to church. I don't care what your religion is. I don't care if you don't want to be going to the Church of England. You're going here. And if you're going to be trying to get out, well, I'm going to chain you down to your seat in church. That's some irony there. That doesn't seem to make a lot of sense. And there in the pulpit, this wonderful pulpit that's in here, is preaching Reverend James McSparran, a wealthy man in his own right. He was given a piece of land on the borderline between what's now North Kingstown and Narragansett. It was called the Glebe, which was a short horse ride from where the church was. And he had slaves too. And he would be up there preaching to the congregation that was there in a typical fashion of the time frame, you know. A lot of it was the fire and brimstone kind of sermons about how if you don't behave yourself, you will certainly be going straight to hell. And so you've got this all going on here. McSparran is an interesting character. He has some of his journals, his diaries survive to this day, portions of it. You could go online and look at them. They're quite intriguing. And he's talking about, on one page, he's going on and discussing his sermon for next Sunday, what he's going to write, how he's going to what he's going to say, how he's going to talk about, you know, God's glory. And on the next page in his diary, he's talking about, you know, my wife came up to me today and said such and such a slave is being difficult. You need to lash him some more. This is in an Anglican priest's diary, you know. One page, talking about the glory of God. The next page, how many lashes I'm going to give to this slave who doesn't do what my wife says. I mean, it's really a remarkable thing. And if you ever have an interest in such things, I think if you just Google James McSparran's diaries, you can see what is available. But it is really something to read, to see this. And so what was going on in here from 1707, remember this is the Church of England, until the beginning of the Revolutionary War, which is the colonies' war against England. So the Anglican Church wasn't real popular at that time frame, as you can imagine, and it closed down for a while during the course of the Revolutionary War. At that time frame, it was used as a barracks for soldiers who were serving against, you know, fighting against the British who weren't local. They lived in it, you know, which is also kind of ironic, you know, soldiers fighting against the British living in the Anglican Church. And then eventually, when the United States of America was formed, the church sat out there for another decade, and then people began to want to pull together a replacement for the church they loved. I mean, you got to think about the Anglican community in New England. This was not only their religious center, this was their social center. They had been going to these churches for generations upon generations, and they wanted to start something up. So that was the nexus for the forming of the American Episcopal Church, which really is just built on the ruins of the Anglican Church in the colonies. And this church eventually was, after a long discussion about the Anglicans who lived here, some who were tied to the Narragansett planters who lived in North Kingstown, some tied to the Narragansett planter descendants who now lived in Narragansett, South Kingstown. They had a battle over where it was going to end up, and eventually the North Kingstown folks won, and it was disassembled and brought here and set up on this site in 1800 and became then the American Episcopal Church. And all the people who were Anglicans came back. Congregation was full. It was a full church as everybody was able to rejoin the population or the religion that they so loved and you know, see the same liturgy, do the same kinds of things. So that was wonderful. But as you can imagine, there was one group of people who never came back, literally in that time frame. And those are the people who used to have to be up there, forced to worship in the Anglican Church, sometimes manacled to the bench up there. They didn't come back. And for a long time, the American Episcopal Church had no black membership. for this reason, because there was an ugly memory that went with places like this. And the same things happened in Newport, the same situation. The slaves were forced to go here. And it was a sad and ugly part of the story, and it's something that the American Episcopal Church now, especially here in New England, is trying to come to grips with and acknowledge their connections to slavery, and especially in Rhode Island, where slavery, as I said, was such a prominent thing. Slavery really was a huge part of Rhode Island's economy, and the church was in the thick of it. And so in the end, they gave over one of their churches up in Providence, St. John's the Divine, over to a group that is in there that is working, and they call themselves a reconciliation center now, and they're working to heal the wounds of this terrible history that existed between these enslaved people and the Anglican Church, and that's helpful. I'd like to talk a little bit about, McSparren's slave that he ended up always having to whip, because he was a different sort of a slave. We think about runaway slaves. I'm sure you've all heard about that imagination. It's in movies, etc. But he was called a wandering slave. He'd wander off the job and wouldn't be around when he was needed. And these kind of slaves show up in records all the time. My slave Juba is always he's never there when I need him. He's always at the next plantation over. And this is something that I incurred in the South as well. And so you wonder, why were they, and they would just say they're lazy, but that really never was the story. This again ties this story back to my family, which is unfortunate. In McSparren's case, his slave was wandering off because he was in love with a woman who was a slave on another plantation. He wanted to see her. As simple as that. He was in love with this woman. They had plans to be married. Of course, they weren't allowed to really get married. They're slaves. They're property. You're not going to let your neighbor's mule marry your mule. They're property, and that's the way they were looked at. But they were in love, and they had a marriage of sorts. And they got together when they could. That's why these slaves were wandering off. And this happened a lot. Wandering slaves became a problem. Now, over in Newport, where the Cranstons were at that time, my family's been in Rhode Island since the very beginnings of Rhode Island. Samuel Cranston, who ended up being the governor of Rhode Island in the 1700s, had a wandering slave who was always going off to visit a woman in a neighboring household. And he got tired of it. He said, this is not helpful. This slave's supposed to be here to serve the needs of my family. And so what did he do? His friend was Daniel Updike, who lived at Smith's Castle. At that time, he's the governor. Daniel Updike is the attorney general. Daniel Updike had a wandering slave too. So they got together and they talked and they said, oh, we'll fix this. I'll swap slaves with you. You take my wandering slave, I'll take yours. We're separated by the Narragansett Bay. That'll solve the problem. They'll never wander again. But what did they do? What did they do is they broke up a marriage, essentially. And I look back at this story and it makes me ill to think, well, this is not a person, is what this story tells me. This is not a person. This is somebody, they're supposed to be here working for me. I don't care what his personal life is about. He's no good to me. And Daniel's got a slave just like it. We'll solve our problem. So these two men who had wives of sorts, in one in Newport and one here in South County, were just shipped off and sent away to another plantation to work out the rest of their days. And the story is noted in the Updike's the chronicles that were put together by Lodowick or Wilkins Updike about his family, about him taking on the Cranston wandering slave and giving up one of his. So it gives you an idea of what the enslaved people of the area were up against, and the way they were treated and the way they were viewed. And at one of our stops, we're going to talk a little bit more about that. But right now, since the church is open, if you want to, I don't know if has anybody not ever been in there? Is everybody? Why don't we just take 5 minutes and go take a look, and then we'll move on. Okay, this is just a short stop at this location. I want to talk about two different Richard Thomases that lived here in Wickford at the exact same time. We see this Richard Thomas, whose father owned the fine house here, and who at the time of the early 1800s, into actually the late 1700s, the early 1800s, was a dry goods store owner. He eventually set up his dry goods shop in the basement of his home, and of course the landscape was quite a bit different in that time frame. The road was a lot narrower, a dirt road, and the sidewalk was a little bit different, and there was a step down into the basement here where Richard Thomas had his dry goods store. And his wife, whose name was Polly, was prominent folks in the community, and was well known. The Thomas family had a lot to do with one of the earliest settlers in the village of Wickford, and they had been here for, by that time, by 1800, their family had been here for generations, and they were well known and well respected in the community. Also a well known and well respected member of the community was also one of the folks like we talked about on Pleasant Street. A gentleman who was of Narragansett black ancestry, who has family members that used to be enslaved by members of the Thomas family. And he indeed, through just circumstance, was also named Richard Thomas. He and his wife, Sarah, lived on Pleasant Street, one of those houses. He was a fishmonger, essentially a fish wholesaler, who bought fish in the community from fishermen, many of them folks of his group, the many black fishermen who fished either from the shoreline or in small catboat style boats out in the bay. And indeed, Braddock Thomas, whose wife Nancy ended up in that house, had been a brother of his. So he was a well-off man, Richard Thomas. And I can imagine the two couples walking up and down the streets and meeting each other and knowing that they have this shared heritage. The other thing that's interesting about it, in the record, he is always called Black Richard Thomas. He's never mentioned, he's never called, anybody wrote anything about him, and I guess probably just so there would be no confusion, would say, oh, I met Black Richard Thomas the other day and his wife, or I went and bought some fish from Black Richard Thomas. So it's interesting to think about what that might have meant to them at that time frame, and I really don't know. I don't know if it was just simply just to be certain that they weren't confused with White Richard Thomas, but... Did
they call him White Richard Thomas?
No, he was never called White Richard Thomas. He was always just called Richard Thomas. And so I just think it's an interesting idea to think about these two fairly well-off, financially. White Richard Thomas was a little better off than Black Richard Thomas, but they were both merchants in this community. They were both known by white and black alike. Both were respected by everybody as being good businessmen, good members of the community. They had this shared heritage, though, and actually, just by coincidence, had the shared name, and would have often had to have met each other on the streets of Wickford and tip their hat to each other or whatever. And it must have been quite an interesting conversation to think that, Black Richard Thomas was owned by White Richard Thomas's grandfather. His grandfather was owned by that gentleman's grandfather. So, but that's the way that things were in this community. And it also speaks a little bit about Wickford and its opportunities for free blacks and free black/Narragansett Indians. Because of the realities that Wickford was a place where almost everybody went to sea, and we actually have many black mariners that went to sea. We'll talk about it at another stop. The village itself, in order to run, every man was at sea or working in the shipyard. All the other kind of things that need to be done to make a village run, they had to go on. In a place like Wickford, and we'll see this if you come next week for the Women's History Walk, in a place like Wickford, just because of the practicalities and the needs and the fact that these communities have been together so long, free blacks were allowed to have these kinds of opportunities, to have jobs where they would be interacting with the white population on a regular basis, to be members of the community, and to be allowed to own property on the same street right next door to a white family, to serve them, to sell fish to white people. And it's just a matter of the practicality of keeping this village going. Black mariners went to sea with white mariners, and they were judged solely on their ability to do their job. So the diverse Wickford that we saw in the 17 and 1800s was also a place where, although I'm not going to say there wasn't prejudice, because there most certainly was, but there were opportunities here for people of color in villages like this they would not find in places like, say, Providence or any of the communities in between here and Providence. They did have opportunities here to make a life for themselves, and many of them did indeed stay on until after the Civil War for generations, and stayed in this community and held these positions and were active members of the community here in Wickford. All right, so we're going to walk across the street. This is the exciting part of the walk, where we all have to try not to get run over by a car, so because it'll ruin the walk for everybody else, and we'll have to get police, and
That's a feat.
yeah, and we won't want that. So we're going to go down and cross over onto Gold Street for our next stop. So we have the large main house that Emanuel Case built. He was a retired innkeeper from the village of Tower Hill, which is a village which doesn't even exist anymore, which was at the intersections of Route 138 and Route 1 up there where the tower is now. I retired here to Wickford Village, and he had slaves, and he had this, the house included this slaves quarter. It was, as you see, a very thin, narrow addition that comes all the way out. It comes out to this location because this is a location where they found good water, and they had a well here, so Emanuel Case was able to have the well for his house indoors in that respect. So the well for the house was in the bottom here, and then there was a servant's kitchen on the other side on the bottom floor where servants would prepare meals for Emanuel Case and his family, and upstairs would be the servants' quarters or slaves' quarters. And this space was utilized for slaves while they were slaves. After that, for a while, and like most of these houses in Wickford, they were then perhaps people, this is always a problem with this street, people who were free blacks took over into those positions and would live in the house. At the time of the Civil War, we see a lot of young black women showing up in the census data for Rhode Island and for the federal census that have their places of origin being Virginia, Mississippi, the Carolinas. So a lot of these were freed slaves who come up to the north to find work. They lived up there. When that period of time was over, we had Irish servant girls showing up again in the census, living in the same locations that were formerly occupied by slaves. So you had a long history of servants living in houses like this, and serving the people who lived in the main house. When we think about slavery in New England, it was different from slavery in the South. When we think about the slavery in the Deep South, we know that typically there was a slave village of sorts, a collection of small cottages and shacks that they lived in outside of the site of the master's house, the big plantation house. They typically weren't living, other than a few select house servants, they weren't living in the building. But in New England, there was a different mindset. They wanted to keep their slaves closer at hand, and in buildings where they didn't have a wing like this, they would live up, and you can see in this yellow house across the way, the John Smith house, they would live up in the attic space. And they would live up in that attic space, and all the slaves would live up there. And the attic spaces of these houses over the years, if they have been restored, they've restored the attic spaces in some of them, and they found little secret stashes of items hidden away by slaves who lived up there in the time frame. Some of these things were things that obviously had come with them even from Africa or from their other lives, things they hid away that were precious to them, and when they were passed away or were sold off to somewhere else, were left behind in that attic space. So it's a direct evidence that they lived up in those spaces. And again, the same kind of populations went on living in the attic spaces in these big houses, free blacks afterwards, and then Irish girls finally going into the end of the 1800s. So you see that the folks who lived in here in the colonial period and even into the beginnings of the time when we were a nation wanted to keep their slaves close at hand. And slavery in Rhode Island is an interesting story, and I'd like to take just a moment now to talk about it. as I said, the slavery was important to the Rhode Island economy. As a colony and then as a state, slavery was really important to our economy. Not only were the slaves doing work, the slaves slave-connected businesses like the triangle trade, and even then later on as the textile trade began, Rhode Island's, or southern Rhode Island's, delving into the Negro goods trade, making cloth for the southern plantations. Everything about Rhode Island's economy was connected somewhere to slavery. And so they were reticent to give up slavery. And of course we have a really mixed story. We have on the surface of Rhode Island saying in the 1770s that no more importations of slaves were going to be allowed into Rhode Island. And of course the word importation is the important part of this. These mean slaves from some other place. Slaves that were here, slaves that were already in the colony, slaves that eventually after the revolution that were in the states, it could be traded back and forth and they could still be slaves here. And this was all, a lot of these laws, these changes, and I like to think of Rhode Island as being dragged and kicking out of slavery because, as I said, it was important to their economy. A lot of these laws were pushed through by political leaders that had Quaker backgrounds in that time frame, because the Quakers, as a group, were against slavery. Although the Brown family, for instance, kind of spoke out of two sides of their face because they profited greatly from their involvement in the triangles trade, and then Moses Brown would go and preach an anti-slavery speech in a church in Providence. Of course, he got his check from his brother every month to live his life, and much of that money came from the Brown's family involvement in slavery. Indeed, the founding of Brown University, some of the buildings were built with some of the Brown slaves, and all the money that made Brown University begin was tainted by the Brown's family involvement in slaves. So they really, although they were Quakers and they spoke against slavery, they still couldn't give up the money. So in 1784, a new law, March of 1784, a new law was passed in the Rhode Island, now the state of Rhode Island, saying that children of slaves are born free. Again, this is March 1784, so any child born after March 1784 is born free. That's what it says on the face. But if you read the law carefully, what it says is that the parents are still slaves, and they also say, well, because the children are going to have to stay with the mother, and the slave owner, the owner of the mother, is going to have to provide nourishment for these children, then they are indentured to that man until they come of age. For that means that for a woman it's 21, for a man it's 18. So for the first years of their lives, although they're quote-unquote born free, until they become of age they're still enslaved. And many of those folks, because that's the life they brought into, they just ended up staying there as technically indentured servants, but still working as if they were slaves. And really, that's the end of Rhode Island's real laws. So if you're born after 1784, you're born free. If you're not, you're still a slave. Nothing else. They never passed a law that said, everybody who's a slave is free now. Never. So what you ended up with is a situation where they passed an auxiliary law later on that said, if a slave owner dies, his slave is freed at that time, which was a step, again, towards ending slavery. So that's the end. So what you've ended up with, if you're just a guy who happens to be owned by a man who lives to be very old, and you happen to live to be very old, you're going to be a slave. And indeed, if you look at Rhode Island censuses, the federal census for Rhode Island, if you look in the 1810 census, there's still probably 100, 150 slaves still left in Rhode Island. 1820 census, in 1820 we still have dozens and dozens and dozens of slaves still left in Rhode Island. 1830 census, we still have dozens of slaves left in Rhode Island. The 1840 census, 1840, we still have a handful of slaves left in Rhode Island. In the 1850 census, we have 2 slaves left in Rhode Island. And the last slave in Rhode Island died And this is a remarkable reality that nobody likes to talk about. The last slave in Rhode Island died in 1855. His master had lived to be 100 years old, and he had lived into his 90s. He died before his master, and he was the last slave. But think about that. This is Rhode Island. You can't hardly get much more north. 1855, a decade before the Civil War. And I like to think about this gentleman. James Howland was his name. He lived in Jamestown. He was a slave in Jamestown. Started out his life as an agricultural slave. As he got older, he was moved into the house to serve his master because he couldn't do the work in the fields anymore. And Jamestown at that time frame, even in the 1850s, was largely just agriculture. There really was nothing going on there but agriculture. So if you needed something, you had to either go to Newport or come to Wickford to get whatever you would need. And I'm sure old Mr. Howland would take his old slave with him to help him out. And as you're walking around in either of these two places in the 1850s, you're going to see on billboards, on the sides of buildings and in shops, advertisements talking about people coming to talk about the evils of Southern slavery. Now, I'm sure James Howland, this old slave from Jamestown, probably didn't read, but a lot of people didn't read. So billboards like that, signage was set up with images that would tell the story. You know, a man in shackles praying. This is a standard image for anti-slavery, the anti-slavery movement. You know, praying to God, I'll be freed. So James Howland, this 90-year-old man, would look at these signs, and I can imagine in his mind he would say, the evils of Southern slavery. What the hell about me? What about me? And that is really part of Rhode Island's story, is that's how critical slavery was to Rhode Island, is that we could still have a slave alive in the state of Rhode Island in the 1850s. It really is a remarkable tale. I challenged the Jamestown Chamber of Commerce a number of years ago. They asked me to come and speak to them, and I said, well, hey, be careful what you wish for. And I did come, and I challenged them to, it's known where James Howland is buried, is to put up a marker. Because James was probably not only the last slave in Rhode Island, he was probably the last slave in the entire free North. Other states did not have slaves that are hanging around. Other states in New England made clear-cut laws that picked a date and said you can't be a slave after this. And Rhode Island never did that. So, but they never put the marker up. Said they didn't like the image it projected about Jamestown. Okay. Another thing that was used by owners and people associated with slavery to control slaves and to show them who is in charge. We're telling you where you live. We're telling you what you're going to do. We're telling you whether you can marry or not marry. If we don't like the way you behave, we're going to send you off somewhere else. I mean, we've heard all this but also part of it was names and naming slaves, because that was not the right of a mother. I mean, a mother might give her child a name, but that was not the legal name of this person. The legal name of the person was the name that the master gave it. And they utilized this naming to, again, show their level of control over the lives of these enslaved people. And they would pick names that were oftentimes mocking, or were oftentimes, you know, something that would make them feel bad. I mean, they picked names that were like biblical names. They would pick names of Greek gods and royalty, and they would pick names that were demeaning as could be. And we're going to talk a little bit about some of those names. I mean, Caesar, Prince, and King were often names that they would pick for slaves. Then there was a whole group of names that were based upon West African naming traditions, which some of the West African groups had specific names for a certain day. If you were born on a Saturday, your name was Kwame. Kufe was a child born on Friday, and there were names like that for each day of the week. And oftentimes those were utilized in these tribal cultures. But in order to, knowing this, and slave traders and slave owners knew this, when they got a child, when they said his name was Kufe because he was born on Friday, oftentimes the slave trader who bought him in West Africa and put him on those ships would would laughingly say, well, you're not born on, your new life starts today on Wednesday, so we're changing your name to the name for born on Wednesday. Or when they were taken in by a slave owner here, they would do that just to try to actually just to mock this long-standing tradition in their area. We're going to go around the corner and talk about one of the more demeaning names in a while, but they also, interesting to get an idea of what they thought about their slaves, is to look in for runaway slave notices, which show up in the Newport Mercury. There's a whole book listing the runaway slave notices. I got a copy of it and reading it, and my wife came up to me one day and say, "You read the weirdest stuff." But I learned a lot about it. I picked out slaves that were from, specifically from South County, from North Kingstown, and so, because I think it says something about the way these people were viewed. And we'll talk about Emanuel Case's slaves, one of the slaves that actually lived right up there. His name was Kufe, which is one of those name and born on day names, and he ran away. Kufe, he ran away in 1786, and Emanuel Case writing to describe him in the Newport Mercury, it's the most bizarre description I ever came across, and this is exactly how it's written. He's a short, thick-set fellow with a long built head. That's how he describes Kufe, and you'll get $5 if you bring him back to me. Phoebe Browning, who lived down in Saunderstown area, had 3 slaves that ran away. Rose, who had a child named Nancy, and Jenny ran away, and Phoebe, in her listing in the Newport Mercury, wrote she would pay money for Rose and her child Nancy, but Jenny is a wench, and I'll only give you 10 cents if you bring her back. Jenny is a wench. Lodowick Updike, who lived at Smith's Castle, the founder of this village, had a slave named Dimas, who he was going to give $6 if you brought him back. He described Dimas as a very subtle fellow, as a forged pass. So he must have had some education, and he had forged a pass to move freely around. If you're a black man walking around, it's like, when you were trying to go to the bathroom when you were in elementary school. You don't seem to have a purpose. You better have a piece of paper saying it's okay for you to be moving around. Willett Carpenter, interesting gentleman who lived down in also in the Saunderstown area at that time frame in the late 1700s. Advertised for 2 of his slaves that ran away. One was named Caesar, and this other name of the other slave, which really gives you an idea of the fact that Willett Carpenter did not value this person as a human being. He had named him for his job. His other slave's name was Handsaw. Handsaw. That's what he did. He had a handsaw. Hey, the guy with a handsaw. His name is Handsaw. John Barber had a slave named Warren. Now, he wanted $120 for Warren, which is a lot of money. Then I found out that Warren was trained as a mariner, and when he wasn't needed in the fields, John Barber would rent him out to ship captains, and he would get the salary. So Warren was somebody who made a lot of money for John Barber, so he was willing to pay $120 to get him back. So it just gives you an idea of how they thought about these slaves. I mean, can you imagine, naming your child, your slave, having a slave as a child and naming him Handsaw? I came across another story about a slave that was named Toby, which seems like a fine name, I guess, but when asked about it, why was he named Toby, he says, "My master named me Toby because it reminded me, he wanted to be reminded of his favorite hunting dog, which died recently." So again, it doesn't say much about the fact that these were viewed as actual human beings. So it's an unfortunate situation. Okay, Washington Street was very similar to Pleasant Street in that the water side of Washington Street was also really took a lot of damage in the Great Gale of 1815. And again, you had small houses being constructed in the place of the larger homes that were here previously that were utilized by folks who were not the wealthy of Wickford. And that's one thing that's remarkable about Wickford. If you walk up and down the streets of Wickford, and even imagine yourself in the 1800s, especially Main Street, you look and you say, where did the regular people live? I mean, look at the size of the homes. I mean, Wickford just, it speaks to the wealth that was here in the community when Wickford was in its heyday. I mean, these are not average sized homes for the 17 and 1800s. These are remarkable large homes, and the streets are just full of them. But you know, in some areas like Pleasant Street and parts of, I'll let this car go by. Parts of Washington Street and parts of Fowler Street, another area that was also hit hard by the hurricane. These small houses sprung up and that were utilized by folks who were not quite so wealthy. So we're here at 5 Washington Street. You can see by the sign it was built in 1791 for Thomas Withers, who was a mariner, and is here for a while. Didn't stay here very long. But by 1800, he sold this house to another mariner that he had worked with. Now, Thomas Withers was a white man. He sold the house to a black man. And as I said, this black man had probably the worst slave name, but his family, many slaves changed their names when they became free to remove the pain from that lifestyle. But this man kept his name, and many of his descendants did as well. His name was Samuel Sambo. Now, Sambo is a name that definitely has connotations of racism, and indeed there used to be a restaurant chain called Sambo's. If you're old enough, you probably remember it, and they ended up changing their name and then going out of business because eventually, as people became more aware, they realized that this is a horrible thing to name a restaurant. It comes from a Swahili name that was given to many slaves when they loaded on the boats, Sambo, T-S-A-M-B-O, Sambo. It's Swahili for monkey. And that's what it means, monkey. So they were loaded on and take this Sambo and put him in the ship. And that became his name, Monkey. So Samuel Sambo, who has this really horrible name. As I said, he kept this name. Many members of his family kept this name for generations. They held on to this name. I guess they wore it as a badge of honor and respect to the folks who had come before them, but they didn't change their last name to anything but Sambo. And he lived in the house from 1800 to 1840. And it's a pretty nice house. You'll have to look at it and and it's hard to imagine that a black man in Wickford could own a house like this. And when I began researching all this, I didn't know the full story and was surprised. I mean, there's a house on Fowler Street that was built, a similar house, sized house, built for a black man. And all of these black men that were really doing well enough in order to afford homes of this size and a nice house like this, they were all mariners. They all went to sea. And as I said, when we talked a little bit over there about the slave who was worth $120, Warren, most of them learned that trade when they were slaves. And either they knew it when they got freed and they were able to utilize it, or they passed the skills on to their son. Because agriculture in the north is different than agriculture in the south. There's a great periods of time when there's not enough for your agricultural slaves to do. And so you are left, you look at this investment, the slave you purchased, as an investment. You want return on your investment. And once the fields are planted here in New England, there's not a lot to do for a while as they're growing other than weeding them. After the crops are harvested in the fall, there's not a whole lot to do in the wintertime. So you want this investment. You bought this young man. He's your slave. You spent money on him, and you want this investment to pay off for you. And so here in New England, what they did with most of the young men that were agricultural slaves was teach them a different skill so that you could then rent them out to tradesmen or other businesses to make money for yourself while they weren't needed in the fields. And when it was springtime, they'd come back, or in that short period of time in the summer when there was not much going on, they'd come back and tend to the crops. So black men were taught many skills. There were black men who were taught to be bricklayers' helpers. There were black men who were taught to be masons' helpers, carpenters' helpers. There were black men who learned the trades in Newport to preliminarily carve and cut gravestones. There were black men who were working in making chocolate out of cocoa. There were all sorts of skills that black men were doing so they could make extra money for their masters in the off-season. Here in Wickford, the vast majority of the slaves that were in agricultural business were then taught to be mariners. They'd go off to sea for the period of time on a ship. You're not going to lose the guy. He's at sea. He's not going to be able to run away. So there was that sort of a guarantee. And his salary, if he was a free mariner that he would have got, goes to the owner. So they were making a lot of money off of these men when they weren't working on their fields. And we got another vehicle coming through. But what happened with these guys, as they finally did become free, if once their master died and they were free, and there was actually an active program going on where wealthy Quakers who were anti-slavery were coming down and offering to buy slaves from non-Quakers and then freeing them. These kind of things also occurred here in South County. Or else their masters just decided to free them because they couldn't afford to feed them anymore. These guys then had a marketable skill. So they were able to go out into the world and get a job. Not only did they have a skill, but they already had a reputation because they were going to sea as slaves, and the ship's owners and the ship's masters and the bosun's mates that were running the cruise knew about their skill set, knew how good they were, and they were able to go to sea and make good money, come back here and buy houses in Wickford. In a time frame where, again, in the 1700s, can you imagine a black man going in Providence, in one of the fine neighborhoods, and saying, I want to buy that house? Not going to allow it to happen. But here in Wickford, because they had already been here in the population for a while, they were serving the community with a valuable purpose. They were allowed to own real estate, and indeed even black women show up in the historic record as being real estate owners here in Wickford Village. So Samuel Sambo stays in the house until 1840, and he dies in the house. And his siblings, or his kids, sell the house to another black man who was another incredible slave name. His name was Nathaniel Onion, the son of Johnny Onion. Johnny Onion was given that name because he was a scullery servant when he was born, and he was the kid who peeled the onions. So the master said, hey, the kid who peels the onions. And that was his name, Johnny Onion. So Nathaniel Onion bought the house. At that time, Nathaniel had changed his name to Gardner. So he was known as Nathaniel Onion Gardner at that time frame. But he too went to sea and left this house each time and go off to sea for probably months at a time. Sailed the sea and had his family living in the house here, taking care of it, and he'd come back to this house. In 1851, though, Nathaniel died at sea. He was thrown overboard, and no notice was given to his family until the ship made it back to Wickford Harbor, which was almost a year later. And his relatives were given a piece of paper, said that Nathaniel died, we buried him at sea, and that was a document that was utilized then so that the home could be passed down to Nathaniel's eldest sister, who had the most interesting name of Thankful Onion. So Thankful Onion shows up as owning this house afterwards. And living in this house, she was a domestic servant and worked for the Thomas family in the house that we can just kind of see through the tree line there. They're just the tan roof that comes up on the other side of the street across from St. Paul's. She was a domestic servant for them, and she lived in this house with her sisters and some of her sisters' children in this house until she got to be very, very old. What's interesting about her, and it's a great opportunity for us to end this talk on, is Thankful Onion, living this life with this slave name, in the early 1860s decided to change her name. And she only saved one letter in her name. In 1862, the Emancipation Proclamation was signed. Thankful Onion went down to the town hall in North Kingstown, and it shows up in the records today where she changed her name from Thankful Onion to Thankful Union, and is now buried in Elm Grove Cemetery under that name, Thankful Union. And it was a deliberate act to change the name to celebrate what had just happened, what President Lincoln had just done. And it's a good way to end our talk today, because I think it brings the story full circle. As I said, Wickford was a diverse place with a lot of black people who ended up suffering through lots of diversity, lots of hardship, but also took advantage of opportunity when it was presented to them. And you got to admire their bravery. As I said, this was still a world where there was an awful lot of prejudice around. But here in Wickford, where the chances arose, men, like Sambo and Nathaniel Gardner and all the other black men, I've identified at least 23 black men who sailed out of Wickford Harbor on ships. Sometimes a ship would sail out of here with a white captain and a white mate and an entire black crew. And sail out, go all up and down the eastern seaboard, go over to Europe and Africa and England, and come back here. So these folks took advantage of the opportunities that were offered to them and made the best of their lives, and spent most of their lives here in the village of Wickford, being contributing members to the community. So I appreciate your spending the time with me today. I'd be happy to answer any questions if you have any now. I did that good a job, no questions. Excuse me?
It said that he was thrown overboard.
Yes.
Do you know why?
He died. He died, was thrown overboard. Yeah, he was thrown overboard. The ship he was on was obviously in the spice trade, which was another lucrative business that was going in and out of the Narragansett Bay. Rhode Island sailors, ship's captain, going over to Africa and buying spices, because he was thrown overboard off the coast of Zanzibar, which was one of the major spice stops for getting spices to bring back to the United States. It was a valuable commodity that they could bring and make a lot of money on. And so he was, which is interesting, because probably his if you go back enough generations, his original Sambo relatives probably didn't come from that far away from Zanzibar. So kind of an interesting way to end his life off the coast of Zanzibar, buried at sea. All right, well, have a great rest of your weekend, and we'll walk back to the parking lot together.